ever feel like you're being listened to by the establishment? I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and happy Easter Sunday. Now, don't readjust your sets. Camilla Tominey will be back next week. This is Christopher Hope standing in. We've got a busy show coming up. We'll be speaking to Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Tory party. We'll speak to the pollster and academic Matthew Goodwin about his new book, which has been making some waves in Westminster behind me and all over Twitter, of course. And 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, we'll be hearing from one of the agreement's key players, Bertie Ahern, who's been speaking to my GB News colleague, Arlene Foster. But for all that, let's go to the front pages. Now, first up, we've got the Sunday Telegraph. Tories at war over pact with Labour in Scotland. More on that from Douglas Ross a bit later on. Next up, the Sunday Times. Its headline says, Labour's dirty tricks here to stay, says Memo. That's about the adverts on social media we've been seeing about Rishi Sunak. Next one is The Observer. Hospitals in frantic bid to fill gaps left by doctors' strike. And, of course, that's a big strike coming this week, which is worrying many people. Sunday Mirror says, I'll fight gangs and guns for my live. That's from Cheryl Corbell, Olivia Pratt-Corbell's mother. Sunday Express says, King to rescue Rishi. That's not literally, even the polls are pretty bad at the moment. That's about the coronation falling shortly after the local elections, which could be difficult for the Tory party. Mail on Sunday, Charles at odds with Church over his diverse coronation, and more on that with Bishop Alan Smith later on. And finally, the Sun on Sunday, I'm going to smash it on tour. That's about the tragic death of S Club 7 star Paul Cattermole. Now, with me now to discuss the papers is John Sargent, a former BBC political reporter. John, it's great to have you on. Absolute legend in terms of political reporting circles. What's your first pick from the papers?
Well, I think choosing this storm, they say, it's over, a war over the demon eyes.
Yes.
We think of it as a demon eyes question, because if you remember years ago, in the 97 election, they had this amazing ad with Tony Blair with eyes that were flashing, making him look like a demon. Well, that's being compared with this present row about these highly personalised attacks that the Labour Party are putting out, with some of their leading figures, including Lord Blunkett, saying we shouldn't do this. So that's the argument that's going on. The Times story, the Sunday Times story, is simply saying they're going to pursue this, they're going to go on doing this right up until the election. Now, that does not surprise me. I think it's a tactic which we can easily understand, which is going directly for Rishi Sunak. Why? Because he's the #1 asset on the Tory side, but also, and this is maybe a more sort of not such an obvious point, they've got to get across the idea that Labour represents change, and Rishi Sunak mustn't be allowed to say, but I'm change. It's not 13 years of Conservative government, I am the change. Now, in political argument, traditional argument, the biggest slogan in an election, the most important slogan, is time for a change. So both parties, both major parties, will be fighting to claim that. We are the party of change. So don't be surprised if this goes right on up to the election.
He's been there 6 months or so, hasn't he? And he's not Boris Johnson. That's his change.
Yeah.
Labour think, well, he's been in power since 2010. Of course, the Tories argue only really been in power on their own since 2019, because all that period until then was shared power with other parties, DUP and the Lib Dems. But going back to the memory there of Demonise, that poster. Now, what's interesting, that poster was never actually went out, did it? If you remember. So I think it's all, so nor is this advert we're seeing this week about Sunak. It's on Twitter, but it's not on any billboards yet. So I wonder whether what you had in the old days was a kind of pre-Twitter storm.
Sure.
About the Demonise.
No, it often happens that way, because what they really want is the publicity. They don't want publicity.
Which they're getting.
Yeah, they don't. Yes, which they're getting in spades, which is, of course, what it's all about, and giving the impression they're cutting through on a major issue. So, to some extent, the details for the campaigners don't matter very much, except they're saying, you know, he's not that great, this Rishi Sunak, and that's all they want to get across.
Because he hasn't been in power for that time. He's only been MP since 2015.
Sure.
You know, he's barely been a minister for any of this time, and he's been blamed for this 12-year Tory record.
But if you imagine what happened when John Major was fighting Neil Kinnock. Neil Kinnock was ahead in the polls. This is 1992. And everyone thought, well, Neil Kinnock's going to win this time. You know, the Tories got into a mess. It's not going to work. John Major won because he represented, wait for it, the change after Margaret Thatcher. He was not Margaret Thatcher. So the potency of this argument is known to everyone at Westminster. They know that this is what matters. So it's not a matter of saying, oh, let's we drop that. There's a bit of opposition. No, they're saying, great. Yes. We've got controversy, we've got cut through, we've got all we want from this campaign, as long as not too many of the leading figures on the Conservative side are associated with this.
And the timing's linked to the May elections or next year's general election?
Well, the whole thing doesn't matter. I mean, as long as you keep going and keep attacking Rishi Sunak would be my completely impartial advice to Labour.
So this of dirty tricks or these questionable adverts is one area, but what's dominating Westminster really is Scotland at the moment.
It is, yes. And of course the Scottish story is absolutely fascinating. And another thing which you've already mentioned is this question of should there be a pact between the Conservatives and Labour. Now, here, the situation is quite different.
That's the front page of the Sunday Telegraph.
That's the Sunday Telegraph. But the important point to realise is this, is that if there was a pact between the Tories and Labour to get rid of the SNP, right? Yes. SNP much weakened by recent events. But the key point to bear in mind is that if that was to happen, who would benefit more, the Conservatives or Labour? No, Labour would benefit more. That's why the Conservative High Command in London is saying, don't talk about this.
That's right.
Don't go on about it.
We'll be asking Douglas Ross on that in a few minutes' time. But of course, there's a big story in the Mail Sunday with the unusual side of a motorhome. Now, why is that linked to this SNP story involving Peter Morrell?
This is a tremendous scoop by the Mail on Sunday, I have to say. I mean, this is to get a photograph of £110,000 worth of motorhome being... the police removing it from outside
on a low
the home of Nicola Sturgeon's husband's mother, right? So it's the in-law. Nicola Sturgeon's mother-in-law lives at this property. She's 92, and obviously what they're connecting it with is the whole fraud inquiry. And it does give an amazing twist, because the neighbours are saying that this motorhome was there for 2 years unused, but that amount of money, £110,000 for an unused motorhome. And the other rather sort of wonderful sort of side to this, wonderful if you're a journalist like me and you like the twists and turns of the story, but motorhomes apparently are very unpopular in Scotland because the people in the motorhomes don't pay for the hotels.
No.
They take out, they reckon, more from the economy than put back in. So motorhomes are not a good look.
And they've blocked the roads. And those narrow roads are stuck behind them.
Exactly.
I guess I wonder if motorhome might become the symbol of this story in Scotland.
Well, it is. That picture
S&P.
is, you know, you just see it. I hope we can put that picture up again. Exclusive. It is an extraordinary shot, and it's very difficult to deny. Yeah. As usual, you can't say, "Oh, it's a fake picture. It couldn't be that motorhome." Oh, no. This must be the motorhome.
Yeah. I wonder if motorhome might become like it was a symbol of this story in Scotland.
Well, I just think once you get into, you know, the motorhome row, but to have it as to have people against motorhomes in Scotland was the twist in the story, which I just couldn't believe that. It was so good.
In the comment pages, there's a very moving piece by Dominic Lawson. It's headline: "My father would tell me to be objective. I'll try." Of course, his father was Nigel Lawson, who you knew, who died this week. You've seen the piece there. It's a moving piece. What's your memory of Nigel Lawson?
It's a very moving piece because the closeness between, you know, the son and the father is just tremendous. I mean, he used to read all his columns.
Yes.
Nigel Lawson used to read his columns. He was an incredibly clever man. He made mistakes, but in sort of general sort of where does he stand in the Conservative history, it's amazingly high. Him and Geoffrey Howe really running the engine room of Thatcherism.
Dominic Lawson says that he could be breathtakingly blunt about columns he wrote. Did you ever find him being blunt about your reporting when you were working for the BBC?
No, well, I had lunch with him when he was Chancellor, and he was extremely polite, not very helpful in terms of giving me comments about what was going on. But there was a moment when I said, now, at some point, you know, careers end, and you know, how would you, if you were resigning, what would it be over an issue, or why might you resign? I was hoping that he would add to this, and he said, no, I'm not going to comment on that. And I said, but would it be fair to say that you'd like to resign on your terms? And of course, in fact, he did resign over an issue, over Margaret Thatcher's.
In 1989, wasn't it?
Yeah, and but I found him, and particularly on this occasion, extremely sort of polite and careful. Yes. But the story about him, which I mean, it's always stuck in my mind, is Margaret Thatcher telling him to get his hair cut. And you just think, isn't that sort of, it's good and bad. It's both of them together being, you know, half affectionate, half critical, just everything.
Do you think the Tory party has learned the correct lesson from Lawson? I mean, the party often thinks, the right does, talk about the huge cut in the higher rate and the top rate of tax in 1988 from 60% to 40%. And he seems, but of course, he had prepared the ground for that, hadn't he, by controlling inflation in the first part of the decade. That may be forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 points come out of this. First of all, Margaret Thatcher, people imagine, was sort of tempestuous and thinking of things like that. She was actually very careful. Lawson, after all, his great budget is after the election of 87. So you think, oh, why not do it before and catch the votes by saying I'm the tax cutter? So they're very careful. But the key lesson, of course, the Conservative government should realise is you've got to be about something. And Lawson provided so many reasons for being about.
And there's his pictures behind the desk of Jeremy Hunt in number 11 Downing Street as of this morning.
And he wrote a superb book about being in the Treasury, View from number 11. He was highly intellectual, brilliantly clever guy, and very much prepared to talk to people and explain things, as he did to me at that lunch. I wasn't a brilliant pupil, but anyway, he was trying to teach me things.
Now, turning to the Sunday Mirror front page, and this interview here with Cheryl about Corbell,
Yeah.
who is the mother of Olivia, who was so sadly shot. Now, this interview is fascinating, but it's often what happens in a tragedy like this, that the family become campaigners for some form of change in the law. And she's calling here, isn't she, for a law to force offenders to attend sentencing, because, of course, the killer, Thomas Cashman, didn't do that when he was jailed.
No, it's a very, obviously, all one's sympathies are immediately with her. So it doesn't want to sort of say, well, you know, I'm going to talk about this as if it's some politician making these remarks. This is someone who has lived through hell, is living through hell, was at the court. He, of course, was in court for the whole of his trial. Cashman was. So the family are there, they see him, they see all this innocence until proven guilty. And, of course, they know then at the end that there's no question of him not being, you know, being totally guilty. And to then find he doesn't come into the dock at the sort of denouement of the whole trial must have been incredibly irritating. You think, right, now you've got to answer. You listen to the judge, this is it. The problem is, if you're then talking about it as a serious proposal, as a proper, not an understandable proposal, but as an actual act that you'd have to put through Parliament, I see enormous difficulties. Are you going to force the person into the dock? Are you going to give them extra sentence? This guy was given a minimum sentence of 42 years. Well, what are you going to do? It will double your sentence if you don't go into the dock. I mean, they can't do that. So it's very difficult to... And then if he's dragged into the dock, they've got to be careful, because it would then give the impression of, you know, mistreating the criminal. You've got all sorts of problems about who's then going to decide whether or not, if he ducks down below the dock, that's a contempt of court or not. And before you know where you are, instead of being the denouement of the trial, it could be just the beginning of another set of extremely unpleasant legal proceedings, because the guy has never. So the complexity of it, and this is why the television trial is where they show the judge speaking. You can see the advantages of that. They don't go to the criminal, because they might start making funny noises or waving or doing all sorts of stupid things. So, and hearing their voice too. That's it. So you want to see the judge, which I think has been very interesting. I didn't think it was going to be that good, but what's interesting is how the judges so far we've seen are not toffs. They don't say, "Oh, hello, you're going to go down for 42 yards." They don't say that. No. In fact, they're very straightforward people, and I think that's impressive.
John Sargent, thank you for joining us this week to review the papers. Do come back again. Great to have you on. Thank you. Thank you. Now, we've got a special edition of the People's Panel coming up today to mark 25 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Dougie Beattie's in Belfast. Dougie, tell us what you got coming up at 10:15.
Well, welcome to Belfast. With me I have writer, journalist and broadcaster and musician Mike Gaston, and one of my first bosses in the media. We have Tierna McKenna. She's a double medal winner with women's football and was right at the forefront of that, and a mother. And we have David Gibson, a offshore engineer, part-time farmer and father. And we'll be talking to them just where Northern Ireland is 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement.
Now, it's been a busy week in Scottish politics. Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Morrell, the chief executive of the SNP, was arrested on Wednesday in connection with an investigation into the party's finances. He was then released without charge, pending further investigation. So, what's next in Scottish politics? To discuss this and more is Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Tories. Douglas, morning.
Morning, Chris. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you, Douglas. Now, thank you for joining us on the Easter Sunday morning. Now, before we get into the SNP and what's happening there, you're interviewed in today's Sunday Telegraph talking about, well, let's ask you the question, why are you asking Scots to vote Labour?
Well, I'm not, Chris, and it's very clear. I think you'll see the quote from me in that article that says I will always encourage Scottish Conservatives to vote Scottish Conservative. And what I'm trying to say is that there are many seats across Scotland where it's our party, the Scottish Conservatives, that are the main challengers to the SNP. So if people want to move on from the decade of division that we had under Nicola Sturgeon, and it's been continued under Humza Yousaf, then voting Scottish Conservative, and that means in some places Liberal Democrat and Labour voters backing the Scottish Conservative candidate, then we can see the SNP lose their grip on power here in Scotland. And I think for many people, that's an option they're looking at, because come the next Holyrood election, the SNP will have been in charge for almost 2 decades, and no one can say Scotland's in a better place as a result of that.
That's not really what the party in London wants to say, though, is it? Because the party in London is saying in this quote, "This is emphatically not the view of the Tory party. We want people to vote for Conservative candidates wherever they are standing, as that's the best way to keep Labour and the SNP out."
Well, the UK and the Scottish Party are absolutely agreed that we want to maximise the number of Scottish Conservative and Conservative MPs, MSPs elected. And in many parts of Scotland, the way to do that is by voting Scottish Conservatives, because by voting for the other parties, it only helps the SNP. So take my seat here in Murray, for example, Chris. We last won this seat before I was elected in 2017, the year I was born, in 1983. But we won it in 2017, and we retained the seat in 2019 because some Labour and Liberal Democrat voters supported me, supported the Scottish Conservatives as the best vehicle to remove the SNP from power here.
Do you worry about how the Tories are doing in Scotland? Because there's been weeks and weeks of concern about the SNP leadership as they debate who should be the leader. Polls show us here that the SNP is on 42%, the Tories far behind on 18%, Labour on 30%. We haven't seen any polling yet since the police issue happened midweek. Why aren't the Tories cutting through? In fact, it does appear that Labour's benefiting more than the Tories from the SNP chaos.
We saw a poll a couple of weeks ago that I think had Labour in Scotland down 4, the SNP down 2, and the Scottish Conservatives up 6. So there's been a range of polls recently. But the fact is, at the moment, the Scottish Conservatives have more MSPs and Scottish MPs than Labour and the Liberal Democrats combined. So people know that we are the biggest challengers to the SNP in many parts of Scotland, and that's why more and more people are looking to the Scottish Conservatives as the party that can remove the SNP from their area, be that in the north, the northeast, the south, in parts of the central belt such as East Renfrewshire. There are real opportunities for people to remove the SNP from power in these areas if they get behind the Scottish Conservatives.
There have been rumours, of course, reported rumours that Police Scotland delayed the arrest of Peter Murrell until after the election of the new Scottish First Minister, Humza Yousaf. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I think where I'm more interested in timing was Nicola Sturgeon's decision to stand down. For her to somehow suggest and continue to suggest it had nothing to do with this ongoing inquiry, I think is frankly absurd. We had an incredible scene this week, Chris, where someone who had been First Minister just 8 days earlier was in a house when the police came to arrest their husband. Now, obviously, that's an ongoing live police inquiry, and I can't go much further into it, but we have seen those scenes of the house being taped off, a police tent outside, and as you mentioned with John Sargent there, an incredible story by Georgina Edkins in the Sunday Mail today of a camper van being removed from Nicola Sturgeon's mother-in-law's house. So it continues to be an incredible story, and one that's deeply damaging, not just for the SNP, but for Scotland, to see this played out in this way.
Yeah. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has denied, of course, any prior knowledge of the arrest of her husband, but should there be some form of investigation by somebody to work out whether this happened and whether there was some form of moving around the political timetable to suit what happened last week?
Well, I think the most important thing is we get to the bottom of this inquiry. It has now been going on for, I think, 18 months, almost 2 years. It's been an extensive inquiry, and we saw that Peter Murrell was interviewed for almost the maximum 12 hours, released without charge, but pending further investigation, and a significant amount of evidence taken away from both their home and SNP headquarters. So I think people want answers, and those answers have to come from Nicola Sturgeon, from Humza Yousaf, and those at the top of the SNP, because there are further reports over the weekend and indeed today that Nicola Sturgeon angrily shut down any discussion about the funds being missing at an NEC meeting of the SNP. So this has been going on for some time, and I'm sure there are more witnesses that will be spoken to about it.
There are calls this morning, Angus MacNeil being one, for the SNP leadership election to be rerun. We've heard rumours that supporters of Kate Forbes are similar in that camp. Do you agree?
Well, I think the SNP always want to rerun any election that comes out with a 52-48 result. That seems to be their regular comment on results such as that. I think the fact is, not just supporters of Kate Forbes, but we had, again, there are so many news stories here in Scotland at the moment, Chris. The current interim Chief Executive Officer of the SNP and the party president, Mike Russell, making some quotes in the Herald yesterday that sounded like he was not particularly happy with Humza Yousaf as the new SNP leader and First Minister, but that's who the SNP voted for. And what I want to see now is the Scottish Government focused on delivering for the people of Scotland and prioritising the priorities of people of Scotland, which is not another independence referendum.
There's not an election in Scotland for some years yet, Douglas Ross, but where do you stand on tax? The Institute for Fiscal Studies says that someone on £50,000 a year pays £1,500 more in tax, someone on £150,000 a year pays nearly £4,000 more in tax because of the way that the Scottish Government can change the 1p due to extra tax on the higher rates of income tax. Would you cut tax if you became First Minister?
Well, I said that in 2021 in the election to the current Scottish Parliament, that the Scottish Conservatives over the course of this Parliament would seek to get our tax take in terms of Scotland similar and the same as the rest of the United Kingdom, because I think it's wrong that people are paying more in taxation here in Scotland to do the exact same job than elsewhere in the United Kingdom. That does cause us problems in terms of recruiting skilled people to do their jobs north of the border.
Next year is the 25th anniversary of the Holyrood Parliament. How many marks out of 10 would you give devolution?
Well, I think devolution has been a good thing in terms of bringing powers closer to the people of Scotland. But actually, the drive for devolution, because London seems too remote from many communities in Scotland, can now be put on the Holyrood Parliament and particularly this SNP Scottish Government. Because I was up in Shetland this week. It's part of the region I represent in the Scottish Parliament. And for many remote and rural areas, Holyrood now seems as distant as Westminster ever was. So I want to see a Scottish Parliament that actually delivers for people and represents the whole of Scotland. And at the moment, that's not happening with this centralising SNP government. It didn't happen under Nicola Sturgeon, and because we've got the continuity candidate in Humza Yousaf, it's not happening under him either.
And how many marks would you give Rishi Sunak at the moment?
I think he's doing a great job, and I think we've seen progressively the Conservatives building more and more support because the public can see a Prime Minister who is quietly getting things done. Many things that commentators, other politicians felt would not be achievable have been delivered by the Prime Minister because he's determined, he works with people across the political spectrum to get results, and we've seen that in a number of different areas, and I am very delighted that the Prime Minister is doing a great job across the whole of the United Kingdom.
And marks out of 10, Douglas?
Oh, well, gosh, I never like that because people will give me marks out of 10, Chris, and that'll be the next question that I don't want to hear the answers to. OK, and just finally, of course, it's going pretty well for you. It's a good quarter, you argue. Rishi Sunak is performing well in the polls. That might explain Labour's attacks UK-wide now on the Twitter about the Tory record on crime. It may not go so well after the May local elections in England, and that may lead to Boris Johnson coming back. What's your advice to party members who might be considering that? Well, I know party members are working flat out across England where there are local council elections, and I want to see good results for the party in those local government elections. And I think, you hit the nail on the head when you speak about the change in Labour attitudes. I mean, the advert that was put out by Labour that has seemingly been endorsed by Keir Starmer is in very poor taste, and one that they would be very quick to criticise the Conservatives for issuing. And I think the silence from some people at the top of Labour is very telling on that.
Well, Douglas Ross, thank you. Lots more to come on the show. You can watch an exclusive interview between Arlene Foster, the former Northern First Minister, and the man who signed the Good Friday Agreement, former Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. We'll also speak to Bishop Alan Smith, the man who convenes the bishops in the House of Lords. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back very soon.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories, controversies and issues.
With us four, plus a special guest.
It's 5 times the opinion, 5 times the debate, and 5 times the fun. The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
You could wink at the end. I can't Britain's wink. Listening.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Lots more to come. In just a moment, you can hear the exclusive interview between Arlene Foster, the former First Minister of Northern Ireland, and the man who signed the Good Friday Agreement on behalf of the Republic of Ireland, Bertie Ahern. I'll be back after the news with Ray Addison.
Thanks. 1 minute past 10. Here's the latest. Patients face unparalleled levels of disruption when junior doctors start a 4-day strike on Tuesday. That's the warning from NHS National Medical Director Professor Stephen Powis. He says he's very concerned with hospitals facing nearly 100 hours without up to half of their medical workforce. The NHS Confederation says 250,000 appointments could be postponed. Police investigating the SNP's finances have reportedly seized a luxury motorhome. According to the Mail on Sunday, the Niesman-Bischoff motorhome, which can sell for around £110,000, was removed from a house in Fife. It was taken at the same time that police searched the home of Nicola Sturgeon and her husband, Peter Murrell. SNP President Mike Russell has described the ongoing investigation as the party's biggest crisis in 50 years. The mother of Olivia Pratt-Corbell has told the Sunday Mirror that the law should be changed to force all criminals to attend their sentencing. Cheryl Corbell has spoken out after her daughter's killer, Thomas Cashman, refused to appear in the dock as he was jailed for a minimum of 42 years. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab says he is planning to change the law. A new survey suggests that more than 1 in 10 teachers have been physically assaulted by a pupil in the last year. The Teachers' Union says they've been kicked, bitten and punched by pupils, whilst more than 1 in 4 have faced verbal abuse from a parent or a carer. The findings have been released during the union's annual conference in Glasgow. Today, delegates will vote on a motion which suggests assaults are seen as a, quote, normal part of teaching in too many schools. The government is expected to crack down on the illegal sale of e-cigarettes to children with a new illicit vapes enforcement squad. The Department of Health and Social Care says task forces will carry out test purchasing at shops. It will also share intelligence with local authorities. The squads will also have the power to remove illegal products from shops and at borders. Thousands of expectant mothers are set to receive a maternity allowance boost of 10.1%. The increase will see payments go up by £15.82 a week. That equates to around £617 over the 39 weeks it can be claimed. The Department for Work and Pensions says the automatic increase will benefit around 40,000 parents this year. China's military has carried out simulated precision strikes on Taiwan, the country's state broadcaster claims. CCTV says forces continued to encircle the island as part of 3 days of military drills focused on the disputed territory. Forces have reportedly been focusing on key targets on land and in surrounding waters. Taiwan's defence ministry has also reported multiple Air Force sorties. The Prime Minister says Christian values of tolerance, compassion and charity are part of the British fabric. In his Easter message, Rishi Sunak also said that Easter Sunday gives us all a chance to reflect on the contribution that Christian communities make across the country. Mr Sunak, who is a Hindu, finished his message by wishing all those celebrating today a very happy Easter. On TV, online, on DAB Plus Radio and on TuneIn. This is GBNews. Back now to Chris.
Good morning and happy Easter. Now, welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Christopher Hope. I'm sitting in while Camilla takes a very well-earned break. We've got a lot more coming up on the show. In just one moment, we'll be going to Belfast for a special edition of the People's Panel. We'll be speaking to the academic and pollster Matthew Goodwin about his new book. And as it's Easter Sunday, we'll be hearing from the Bishop of St Albans, Alan Smith, the man who convenes the bishops who sit in the House of Lords. But first, 25 years ago tomorrow, an historic agreement was signed between the UK and Ireland and parties in Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement set up a new devolved government for Northern Ireland, which would include representation from both the Unionist and Nationalist communities. It helped to end over 30 years of violence in Northern Ireland. One of the men who signed that treaty was Bertie Ahern, the Irish Prime Minister, or Taoiseach. Earlier this week, he sat down and spoke to Arlene Foster, GB News presenter and former First Minister of Northern Ireland.
Bertie Ahern, Taoiseach for 11 years. You became very much a politician from Dublin and you became then the leader of Fianna Fáil and Taoiseach in 1997, around the same time as Tony Blair became Prime Minister in the UK. And just before that, had the first IRA ceasefire in 1994. And then we'd had the forum elections in 1996 in Northern Ireland, where politicians were coming together to have conversations, maybe for the first time in a long time. And then shortly after you became Taoiseach, we had the second IRA ceasefire.
My involvement probably intensified from the 91-92 talks.
Yes.
I wasn't a part of the team, but I was finance minister then. So I was very involved in that. And then I was finance minister at Talbot Reynolds. So right through that 93, when we were working on the Downing Street Declaration, I was very involved in that team. And then into 94, which was the ceasefires, which was a great year because it was great hope and great confidence. 95 went the other way because nothing happened in 95. And then Tony Blair and I kind of met up at that stage, 94, and we started working together on the basis...
When he was in opposition?
Both of us were leaders of the opposition. So both of us started working on what would happen if we were there, what we tried to do. So we had a lot of engagement with Mo and 95, 96. So we were kind of ready. We had our plan in 97. Now he had a huge majority. He was going to win by a cricket score. I had our game down here is always close. So we were hoping. So anyway, he got in May, I got in June, and then off we went.
Yes, and then, as I said, the second IRA ceasefire came, and that, of course, helped you in your planning because you had hoped to start the ball rolling.
Yeah, I mean, if we didn't get that ceasefire, there wouldn't be no talk. So it was that narrow window, which, as you know, was contentious at the time because we only had the ceasefire in July, and then our plan was to start the talks in September, which was, problematic at the time.
Looking back then and looking at the scepticism of unionism at that time, I mean, did you understand that given what had happened over the past 30 years?
I did. Because I was one of the younger guys in Fianna Fáil in those days, I did a lot of the student debates.
Yes.
So various unionist people come down to those. In fact, Jeffrey Donaldson was one of the guys who always came down, even in the 80s. So I got to know him in those, and lots of others, the McGimseys who's come down. So, and of course, we'd always be, at each other's throat a bit in the debates because the motions were always. But you did get the sense. It was very useful in Trinity or UCD, DCU, of where unionists were at, and. It was a very good education because, the debates were light-hearted enough, and the debates were tough. But then you'd meet afterwards and you'd have a conversation, and you'd get the sense of the violence and the victims, and you got a far better understanding than just watching the news or reading the papers.
And you've been talking a lot about the Belfast Agreement, obviously, because we're in this 25th anniversary, and so has Tony Blair. And I've noticed that both of you have been very strong on relationships and trust, and just what you're talking about, trying to understand the other side, as it were, and where they're coming from. I mean, that was critical, surely, to building that trust up until April.
I mean, to be honest, if the way it is in politics, people say, leaders should be very strong and forthright and they should be clear on their views. And the reality is, if you do that, you'll never do anything, because if you don't go in to try and find solutions and compromises and understand people and build confidence and trust, well, you're wasting your space. You're not going to do anything. So I think what I always try to do, I very much honed my thinking around where do you find the middle ground? I mean, where you understand the problem, understand what people are saying, and then try and see if you can be of some use to the process. And the more you do it, the more you understand, because you do see where the other person is at and why they're at that position. And they're not at it because today is Monday and yesterday was Sunday. I mean, they're at it because of some huge conviction in their life. So, that was always what I tried to do.
And I mean, applying that to post-2016, do you think that's where maybe all politicians lost their way a little bit in terms of not trying to understand where the other party was coming from? Yeah,
there's no doubt about it. That, I mean, I think in recent years, I mean, if everyone takes up their position, and you can understand one group do it, the other group do it, so and then it's zero-sum game.
Yeah,
zero-sum game. And that's the difficulty. And you know, like, and it's probably not only in our politics, Ireland, you see in America, you know, I mean, God help us, I mean, it's the free world and the great democracy that I loved. I mean, I loved American politics from time as a kid, you know, and probably more interesting than I was in any other politics. You're watching, you know, my father and mother loved Kennedy and all of this stuff, and you'd be watching. But like now, nobody wants to deal. And I think that's where, you know, maybe we've got a bit lost as well, that everyone just sets, you know, their position, and then nobody wants to move forward, because, you know, there's so much in the absence of violence. Then you have to make political progress, and I think that you'd be a bit fearful of a new generation, you know, far younger than me, that they don't remember where all this was, and they just don't understand that we need to make compromises to move forward, because it is a shared space. We still have a divided society. There is the Britishness and Irishness, or both, you know, so we have to continue to work at that, and there doesn't seem to be an awful lot in that at the moment.
I sat in a debate last week around legacy, and Lord Eames was talking about the fact that we haven't spent enough time on reconciliation recently, and looking back at the Belfast Agreement, if you could go back today and insert a couple of things, what would those things be, Bertie? What would you try and deal with?
I think there were probably two things that were a pity. That, you know, decommissioning became a nightmare.
It did.
You know, that was the first thing, and it got us off to a bad start. You know, it's like in my football terms, we were 3 down before you start. You know, and I think that was a pity, because we spent huge energy. Tony Blair and I spent huge energy from '98 to 2003, 5 hard years.
Well, it became the only topic during those years, didn't it?
That's period we should have been getting a good win behind other things. And then the other thing is legacy. We did nothing on legacy. Just the other day, I met Reverend Mason, you know, the Methodist leader. I met a group with him. And there was one girl there who really struck me. Her father was an RUC man, and was the IRA blew her father up, and in the process blew her mother up. The two of them were killed.
Yes.
And 10 years later, she was involved in a bomb where the IRA killed 6 British soldiers, and she lost her legs.
Yes.
You know, it's a horror story in her life. You're struck by these things. I know these stories go through all the communities, but, you know, that legacy issue is still there. I'm not sure how you deal with it. I had the honour of meeting the clerk and Mandela here when we had the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. In the early years, before that group collapsed when the ceasefire broke down, and it never came back, which was a pity, because they were looking at reconciliation and, you know, trying to build the confidence. And when I asked, after meeting the clerk and Mandela, was there any takers for the South African model? And I always remember it, because I was left in the room on my own. All sides didn't want to get into that, and that's 25 years ago, and we still haven't solved it.
Yeah, it is a very difficult thing for a lot of victims when they saw the prisoners getting out of jail, and yet they were just meant to move on and forget what had happened.
Yeah, and in some cases, as some of them pointed out to me, they saw some of the people who were involved in the Troubles receiving compensation when they, you know, and you can understand, like, you have to get a collective solution. But I'm not saying it's easy, but you need something, some way of giving some closure. I don't think it's possible to get total closure, you know.
Because a lot of it's personal as well.
Yeah, and I understand that. I can understand, but I think we haven't got to a position that you can be comfortable with, and or that I feel comfortable with. And 25 years on, I think if you asked me the question, decommission at the start, now I think legacy. And then the last bit, we should try, I think, to find some way where there can be ongoing fresh thinking of what is the next steps, because...
Well, I was going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you, if I'm back here in 25 years with you, Bertie, what will we be talking about then?
My personal view, I mean, we've only had... I remember putting in the review clause. There was a discussion early on, not in the last week, but maybe a few months out. And we had a discussion one evening, and we said, we better put a review clause into this, whatever happens, because there will be times when circumstances change. People change, times change. So we put in the review clause. We've only had one, which you're familiar with in St Andrews.
Yes.
And we made some changes in that. I think probably if we get the institutions up, and hopefully I keep on saying when we get them up, so when we get them up, I think there is a necessity for review. We have to get away from the position that this is stop-go, stop-start. And
it has been since 1998.
It's been painful. And I think we have to find a way that. Now, I know it has to be cross-community consent, because if we don't do that...
Yes, I noticed Tony Blair's remarks about that. That you know, if you're going to do something, it has to be something that everybody agrees to. You would agree with that?
I agree with that, because our whole... the whole foundations of anything that we have achieved, we haven't achieved everything, but anything we have achieved, I think, is based on cross-community consent. But the reality is, if you don't get agreements, you're going to run into trouble. You might get over today, but you'll be in trouble next week. So I think we need to try and find a way where institutions, all of the institutions, all of them, because there's 4 or 5 of them in the agreement, that they only collapse when it's election time, and that we just have to get that basis, and people have to, and I think if that's done, people then will accept that's the position. You won't be able to have these you and I are familiar with all parliaments, but if in Westminster, if everything collapses because somebody didn't like something in energy policy, or in Dáil Éireann, and it collapses because someone doesn't like something in fishery policy. I mean, you can't have that. You just can't have that in a democracy. It's just not possible.
A final question I was going to put to you is, somebody said to me the other day that peace isn't a destination, it's a process. And do you think that we have spent enough energy in making sure that it is that process of reconciliation, and that we are moving in the right direction?
I think we need to do far more on reconciliation. I really do. We're starting, when Albert Reynolds and John Major were there, it was a Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, and I don't think we have done that reconciliation. And I think the
new generation, I feel, are perhaps not they don't know as much, if you like, as you would like them to know and understand.
And they're not too tolerant either. Like some people, they'll say to me now, sure, the way forward is just the middle ground, and you move on. And you try to explain to them, as I've done many times, so it's not so simple. Your generation might be able to just move on if you haven't been affected, or if you've been cushioned from the problems. But if you haven't been from that, and if I'm always struck when I go to East Belfast, West Belfast. I mean, you can walk down the street and you get opinions that are so diverse, and some people in East Belfast think everyone in Dublin are all in the IRA, and vice versa. So it's no good thinking that we've actually got over these things, and that comes from today's politicians and into the future. I think they have to be talking messages of reconciliation and peace and confidence.
I often find
not digging up things,
Yeah, if people don't, you don't have to agree with someone's politics to have a conversation with them.
No.
And I think we've lost the art of that civic discussion and understanding.
I think a bit of education is of how bad things were is a help when you're trying to go forward, because sometimes, and I find this with students, if I can say those, but sometimes it's simplistic solutions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as you know, Arlene, I know, these aren't simplistic issues, and that's a reality we have to understand.
Bertie, thanks for sharing with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Arlene.
Thank you.
That was Arlene Foster speaking to Bertie Ahern, the former Irish Prime Minister, or Taoiseach. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have a special edition of the People's Panel this week, coming live from Belfast. GB News' Dougie Beattie is there for us. Dougie, what's been the reaction from your panel to that interview?
Well, welcome back to Belfast, and yes, joining me now again, my panel will go firstly to Mike Gaston, broadcaster, journalist, and first boss of mine in the media. We were about in the 80s and 90s, and unfortunately old enough to remember that. Just very briefly, what would be the key words you would take out of Arlene's interview there?
Relationship, trust, legacy are the three things that came out for me in that, because the past is a place to learn from, not a place to live, and the past is a place to plan the future and move forward with it, and that's what I took out of that.
Tierna McKenna, a footballer, sportswoman, mother, you would never remember the troubles of Northern Ireland. I mean, what would you, listening to that, if that was another country, what would you be saying at this point?
I can only really judge it on the stories that I've been told from family. So a big thing similar to Mike would be legacy, and maybe the lack of legacy that has come about in the years since the Good Friday Agreement.
David, you're an offshore engineer involved in the fuel industry and a part-time farmer and a father, so you have to operate business at one side and business at the other. What did you take out of it? What were the key words there? I mean,
well, I think on an easy piece is a lot better than no piece. There's still a lot of strands of the Good Friday Agreement that still need worked on effectively. That's very difficult with the state of Stormont at the minute, but it takes people, and good people in the right place, there's always hope.
You say about the state of Stormont at the moment. I mean, where do you see it as a businessman? Take any religious hat or unionist, nationalist hat off you. Where do you see Stormont at the moment as a businessman?
A very difficult place to try and get anything done. Northern Ireland's very difficult to try and get anything done. Import, export, volatility of prices, getting our produce shifted over to the UK at the minute is exceptionally difficult and only getting harder.
Tierna, as we've said, you wouldn't have remembered the Good Friday Agreement, really. You were a child at that stage. You have a child of your own now. I mean, what do you hope to see for the future of Northern Ireland, especially someone that's involved so much in sport?
I came from a very respectful family who taught me to be respectful of my family, friends, neighbours, and I suppose I've seen the fruitness of the Good Friday Agreement in that I've been able to excel and go and enjoy sport and socialise with people, no matter what their religion or what their beliefs were, and to respect that. So for me, being a young mother, I'm blessed to know that he will be able to do and grow up more in the environment that I have been able to, and that's all thanks to the Good Friday Agreement.
Mike, you and I both were in the heart of the trouble, seen some things that we should never have seen and probably will never ever forget. And so for us, we are caught much more in the minutiae of the past and what went on there. But do you think it helps us see the future more clearly?
I think days like today help us to see the future more clearly because we reflect on the past, the things that, as you say, that we shouldn't have seen, the things that we did see, looking into the eyes of victims, eyes of the bereaved, eyes of people in pain. And learning from that and feeling that at the time. We have to learn from that, and today helps us to do that because we think about issues like relationship and trust. We recognise that we need to build on those relationships across all strands of our society, and we need to learn to trust each other and to move forward because at the minute we're not really moving as far forward as I would like to see us doing.
Well, the Good Friday Agreement, of course, is built on consent and respect, and of course it would never have come together unless that had been given. Do you think now that politicians very much have got to their ground where they are and they're standing their ground and not going forward?
I think for me it's an awful shame that we conduct our politics in very much an adversarial situation and very much a winner-takes-all situation. We're still playing party politics in the playground where we should be playing politics for the people in Stormont and getting things done and moving us forward.
Tierna, you're going to have a child that's going to school very shortly. You're well, not very shortly, within the next 5 years. And I mean, once that happens, once you become a parent, your outlook on life changes drastically. What would you really like to see? What's the main things that you would like to see going ahead in Stormont at this moment in time?
I think we need infrastructure that's working, that is going to make change. We're seeing terrible no movement with regards to educational needs. We see funding cut, not only across schools, NHS, all the public sector requires funding from Stormont. And no doubt within the 5 years now that until my son will go to school, if that doesn't come very quickly, we're going to see how much this has affected us. And really, in hindsight then, we'll look back and say, well, all we needed to do was have people talking and working together in order to bring about better results, and we would have maybe I enjoyed my school life. I reaped the benefits of the Good Friday Agreement, being able to come from Lisburn and go to school in West Belfast. I just hope that my son is able to go to school, enjoy it socially, and have nothing. We'll not be able to look back and say, I wish I had done this, or I wish we had done this.
You're probably one of the most fascinating here, because you also represented women's football right from the very start, and you were a real cheerleader and pushed it forward, appeared many times to have that done. How do you think that has changed over the last few years, never mind 25 years, that women have come to the forefront? Women's sport has definitely benefited. As you say, in the years that I haven't been playing, there's been such progress in the game. Girls can go out and participate as and when they wish. They have role models now, and the funding is there to continue that growth. And it's very, very exciting for women's football across the board, not just with football, but netball, hockey. Everyone's reaping the benefits of it. David, you're very much, you have sons, and they will probably become very practical people, as most farmers are. And of course, back in the days, even before the Good Friday Agreement, Tony Blair was talking about education, education, education. We're now seeing that there is a big problem amongst young males throughout Britain that don't seem to fit that mould. Where do you think that they will fit, or how can we make those young men fit inside Northern Ireland and have a sense of belonging?
We'll just go back a little bit. I think education in Northern Ireland has always been very segregated, and I think we need to look at integrated education from a very young age. It stops the segregation all the way through until you get to university, and it's the first time a lot of kids mix. The first time I started to mix with different religions when I went to Queen's University, and that's really too late. A lot of opinions are formed at that time, especially growing up during the Troubles. So I think integrated education is a fantastic way forward. That would bring an awful lot of people together, really see that there aren't any differences. Everybody struggles from the same socioeconomic issues, and it would let them come to a better solution as well as we move forward. But as for my sons, who knows what they're going to turn into? They'll decide for themselves. I'll certainly not push them to go away and work away from home, and I'll certainly not push them into farming. And whatever they want to do, I would try and support them as best as possible. In the farming side of things, do you think it's got much better in the last 25 years, or has it got worse? It's become a lot more mechanised, but farming itself is still a tough industry. You do an awful lot of hours, and you're certainly not guaranteed a minimum wage of any type at all, like any self-employed person. Yeah, that is a story for the future, especially with food prices going up at the moment. Mike, back to you. And I mean, really, what has been the biggest benefits of the Good Friday Agreement, do you think? If you had to nail one or two of them down.
I think that we are lucky to live in such a fabulous place, where the scenery's fabulous, the countryside's wonderful, the people are the warmest people you're likely to meet anywhere. Sense of hospitality, the tourism offer is brilliant these days. And I think what the Good Friday Agreement has done for us is to make developing that and recognising that and using that so much better. I mean, we're really lucky in Northern Ireland. We don't have a rush hour. We have a rush 10 minutes. We have uncrowded roads, uncrowded streets, and a place that's just longing to welcome visitors and make it a great place for all of us. And that's, for me, one of the benefits and blessings of the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, there you are, Chris. Send it up at the very end. Mike Gaston just wrapping Northern Ireland up beautifully. A wonderful place to live. And if only our politicians could get it together and really stand strong on where they are, and especially if politicians in London can watch that and know, look, we are ready to do business. We need things sorted out. And at this moment in time, I think politicians maybe need a bit of a help and a bit more support as to a way out.
Well, thanks a lot, Dougie. Let's hope they're watching. Now, Camilla will be back next weekend, and so will the brilliant People's Panel. As ever, if you want to apply, please go to www.gbnews.uk/panel. We've got lots more to come on this show. Matthew Goodwin will be here talking about his new book. And I'll be joined by the Bishop of St Albans on Easter Sunday, Alan Smith. Don't go anywhere, we're back in a tick.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Good morning and welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm not Camilla, I'm Christopher Hope. But I'm glad to say I'm now joined in the studio by academic and pollster Professor Matthew Goodwin. Matthew's with us to talk about his new book, Values, Voice and Virtue, which was released last week to some reaction. Before we go to the reaction, Matthew, what's the book about?
Well, the book is about the rise of a new elite in British politics, which is gradually losing touch with the country. I point at a left-leaning group who tend to disproportionately dominate the media, the cultural institutions, creative industries, also politics. It's not just about people on the left or in the Labour Party. This new elite are also visible within parts of the Conservative Party. Yeah. I think many people who are watching this show will be perhaps already aware of this group, what they think, and I just put it out there. I said this group's losing touch with the country.
You define the person that you're describing. How old are they? Where do they go to university? How do they vote in the referendums, elections? Yeah. How are they? Who are they?
So the interesting...
Are they white? Are they male?
Yeah, the
female?
interesting thing about this group is, they often went to Oxbridge or Russell Group University. They tend to lean very left on issues like immigration. They wanted to remain in the EU. They really hate Brexit. They're very proud of their liberal identity. They've become much more liberal over the last decade. They absolutely hate Boris Johnson. They live in the cities, the university towns, and they increasingly look down on other people in society. They increasingly identify themselves as the winners, the morally righteous, radically progressive, luxury belief class, and they derive status from projecting their sense of moral righteousness.
And your point in the book, I think, is that they advocate for things that don't affect them. These are free hits, so maybe immigration won't affect their wages because their wages aren't affected by more people coming to the country.
Well, you know, the interesting thing, Chris, is the new elite has spent 20 years advocating policies that bring them status and aren't really costly for them, but which impose big costs on other people. Mass immigration would be one, hyper-globalisation would be another. Let's hollow out the economy, let's turn Britain into an economy that's dependent upon mass migration and consumption. And of course, they're the winners. They're in the cities. They've got the money. They've got the big housing increases in the housing prices and so on. So they don't need to worry about the effects of this. And we now see this with sex, with gender, with history. They advocate a very negative view of who we are, of British history and identity, whereas lots of voters out there, Chris, really care about their national identity. They care about their national history. And so the new elite now today is also really stripping away something that gives people a lot of status, a lot of recognition. And that's why I argue this group is really now reflecting what another academic, Rob Henderson, has called the luxury belief class. They get a sense of righteousness and status by sitting on Twitter every day. They're much more likely to use Twitter.
Too much on Twitter.
They spend all their time on Twitter either abusing or criticising people that don't share their beliefs or projecting their beliefs to others to win status.
So who are these people? You wrote a piece in the Times, which is the paper of the establishment. They published it. There was some reaction to that.
Yeah, I've had a strange week on social media, Chris. I found myself being widely criticised by members of the new elite. I mean, I had Mehdi Hassan, private school, Oxford. I had James O'Brien, private school, LSE. I had David Aronovich, went to Oxford. John Paul Tez went to Oxford. They sort of lined up one by one to deny they were part of this new elite and to deny it even exists. But what they exhibited, Chris, this is important, is another key feature of the new elite: political intolerance. All the evidence shows that members of the new elite are the most likely to unfriend people who hold views they disagree with, block them on social media and Twitter, to feel very worried if their son or their daughter marries somebody across the political divide. God forbid their child marries a Brexiteer. God forbid their child marries a Conservative. And they are consistently not only the most likely to only associate, socialise and marry members of their own group, but they are the most likely, Chris, to express political intolerance. So while they say they're liberal, they say they're enlightened, often when it comes to politics, they are among the most illiberal.
Is it possible we're overblowing this, that in a sense these are people who are noisy on Twitter, they've got opinions, that's what Twitter is for, but the real elite are nowhere near Twitter? These are very rich people who are very well off, they get government contracts, they benefit financially from their friends in government. Shouldn't we go after them rather than noisy people on Twitter?
There is an old elite. Nobody's ever said there isn't, and I talk about this in the book. I say there is a sort of merchant elite, a conservative elite. You can see it in the donor class, in the Conservative Party, in the city. You can see it the business CEOs. There is an old elite, Chris. But what I'm arguing in this book is that today the axis of power is tilting. It is tilting away from that old elite, which, by the way, used to be economically adrift from everybody, but culturally tended to share the same values as many voters. Today's new elite is different. Economically, politically, culturally, they are drifting
Is it real
away
power, though?
from other people.
Is it real power or just influence? Because they're different, aren't they? Influence is this dreadful term to describe people who are busy on social media, but power is something completely different.
Well, I'm not only talking about social media, Chris. I'm talking about people who disproportionately dominate.
On policy level.
Media, civil service, creative industries, cultural institutions, cultural power, political power, not just economic power. And this is one of the key arguments that I think people have missed. Anybody watching this show who went through the last 10 years, maybe they voted Conservative, maybe they voted for Brexit, maybe they voted for Boris Johnson, have probably spent much of that time looking at the BBC debates, the newspapers, the adverts on television, the films, the books on the bestseller list, etc., etc. And they've probably just felt, my values are not reflected in this national conversation. And even worse, I can't really say what I want to say within this conversation because then I'm called a racist, a gammon, an ignorant, bigot, etc., etc. And I think this is the issue, Chris. We are talking about a national conversation which over the last 20, 30 years has become incredibly narrow so that it only really reflects the values and the voice of this new elite. And what I'm saying in this book, right, the reason why I'm talking to all media, why I think GB News and all new media are important, is because we need to diversify the national conversation. We need to have a much
How do you do that, Matthew?
Well, number one, we need to say to media, it's not on that almost every single columnist comes from the same background, the same schools, the same universities, and holds the same set of values. We need a much wider range of voices in our media
readers won't tolerate that. Don't their readers of these newspapers want to see what they're reading?
Well, why are so many people leaving legacy media, Chris? Why, you know, the listener figures on Radio 4 today are down massively. Why is that? The BBC, levels of trust in BBC are down. So newspaper readership is down. I think, actually, this is part of this problem, you know, that people are looking at politics, the national conversation, the public square, and they're just saying people like me aren't even in this national conversation.
Someone like you, though, you're a professor of politics at the University of Kent, but you went to Salford University, you educated in Canada as well. Are you part of the elite yourself or not?
I mean, I'm certainly more part of the elite than lots of people. I mean, I would also say I was first person in my family to go to university, and I didn't go to the Oxbridge or Russell Group universities, but I certainly hold my hands up and say I'm more of part of an elite than lots of people. But I think what's interesting, Chris, is the new elite are very bad at holding the mirror up to themselves. And all I'm saying
and they
is...
hate it,
they absolutely hate it. And now I'm persona non grata because I've sort of held the mirror up. But it's an important thing to do, because if you want to understand how British politics got here, the rise of populism, Brexit, Boris Johnson, we have to understand how this group lost touch with the country. Mass immigration, hyper-globalisation, the hollowing out of our democracy. Very few people wanted these things to happen. The new elite did, many other people didn't.
There's clearly an audience out there because it's riding high in the Sunday Times bestseller charts today.
But not only this book, Chris, right? The last month, think of Hannah Barnes and her book on the Tavistock Clinic saying something went fundamentally wrong here in what we're doing to kids. Nigel Bigger's book on Empire saying actually British history isn't just negative and toxic, and now my book calling out the new elite. Now I'm going to make one suggestion, Chris. Maybe the publishing industry has got this wrong. Maybe there is enormous appetite out there for people who offer something different, countercultural takes.
Mark Francois self-published his book on Brexit, which he'll tell you was because he couldn't get a publisher from the Remainer establishment.
There we go.
On that note, well, Matthew Goodwin, thank you for joining us this week on Camilla Tominey's programme. It's great to have you on. Now, it's Easter Sunday today, one of the most important days in the Christian calendar. To mark the occasion, I'll be joined by Alan Smith, Bishop of St Albans and convener of the Lord's Spiritual. That means he's the spokesman for the peers who are bishops in the House of Lords. In just one moment. Don't go anywhere.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Christopher Hope. Now I'll be speaking to Alan Smith, who's the Bishop of St Albans, in just one moment. But first, Olivia Utley is in the GB News hot seat at 11 a.m, sitting in for Michael Portillo. Olivia, what's coming up?
Hello. Yes, we've got a very busy show planned from 11 till 1. We'll be talking about Keir Starmer and his dirty tactics, is it, leading up to the next election. We'll be talking, is it time for Australia to become a republic? There is some Republican sentiment swelling up over there. And we'll also be having a great discussion about the new, most depressing play to hit the West End, A Little Life, with the online editor of the Express art section. So please don't go away. Lots to look forward to in the next show.
Sounds fantastic, Olivia. And you're filling in for Michael Portillo this week, so I hope you had a good time. Now, it's Easter Sunday today, one of the most important Christian days in the calendar. As well as playing a role as faith leaders, there are 26 of England's most senior Anglican bishops also play a role in making laws in the House of Lords. But should religion and politics mix in this way? Alan Smith is the Bishop of St Albans. He's also the convener of the Lord's Spiritual. That's how they're described in the Lords. Alan joins us now from St Albans Cathedral. Alan, it's a busy day for you. Thank you for spending the time and coming on to GB News.
Well, thanks very much, Christopher. It's great to be here on this most important day in the Christian calendar.
Now, you're the convener of the Lord, the bishops who are in the House of Lords. What does that actually mean?
Well, essentially, we don't take a whip. We're all totally independent. So my job is to just try and make sure everybody knows what's happening and that we are briefed when we come in. And then, as bishops, we engage fully in the House of the Lords, whatever the business of the day is.
So essentially, you're the kind of spokesman for the bishops in the House of Lords. I don't know if you'll be able to read the papers this morning. I know it's a very, very busy day, Easter morning. There's been a report in the Mail on Sunday talking about how there's some concern about whether the leaders from the Muslim, Jewish and Hindu faiths should read prayers at the coronation, and this is delaying the order of service being printed. Is that a concern you've picked up?
I've certainly heard all sorts of discussions, and I know that the King is very concerned that the coronation will reflect the huge diversity of our country today. Although, of course, our culture is deeply rooted in the Christian faith, which is what the coronation rite is actually based on. So I know a lot of work and a lot of consultation has been going on with all sorts of different leaders, both secular and religious.
So there is a role, is there, for other faiths in what essentially is an Anglican service?
Well, I think there will be a huge, wide representation of people coming from all sorts of backgrounds and all parts of society. And not only that, but of course from the Commonwealth and beyond. So it is going to be a microcosm of the communities, both in this country and more widely around the world.
How do bishops decide what to speak out on? Often there are some rows when there's concern about the immigration policy of the current government, and that's expressed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And just today, in the Sunday Telegraph, the Archbishop of York calls for safe and legal routes for migrants to enter the UK. Do you worry that sometimes bishops and maybe the Church gets into areas where it might just annoy members of the congregation if they feel they're being political, when really they want a bit of spiritual guidance?
Well, I think all of us try to avoid being party political because that is the job of the politicians. And I don't feel a vocation to be a politician. I believe God's called me into ministry. And clearly our main job is to speak about the spiritual realm. And indeed today, this great celebration, I've just come out of a packed cathedral. I'm in one of the side chapels. And we've been proclaiming the good news of the resurrection of Christ. And that's our core business. But of course, the word politics means city. It's how we organise our lives. And the moment you start thinking about how we organise ourselves, it's going to touch on political issues with a small p. So I think that's unavoidable. And our job is simply, I think, to try and engage in the process, as indeed all citizens should.
There's some polling out this week, Bishop, from Savanta, saying that 39% of people don't care about the religious meaning behind Easter. Is that worrying for you as a church leader?
Well, I think, of course, I'm concerned about it because at the end of the day, my sort of deeply held conviction that's driven me through my whole life has been that the core of the Christian faith is good news for all people. So I'm deeply sorry if some people have not understood or experienced or entered into that. Although we're very clear, we can't and wouldn't want to try and force anybody to believe anything they don't believe. So we will continue to proclaim. Yes, I'm sorry there aren't more people. I have to say, across Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, which I have responsibility for, we're expecting packed churches all over the place. But there's loads of people now who don't have that close connection. And it's one of the things that as the churches and as Christians we're keen to change.
I guess people might think that maybe the focus of the church should be on getting more people, more bums on seats in the pews than speaking out on the national stage. Is that the tension that you have to run your life by?
Yes, I mean, to be honest, the main focus of my life day by day is about proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ and engaging in this, in the faith. That's absolutely what I spend the vast majority of my time doing. I actually spend a relatively small amount of time in the House of Lords and dealing with other issues. But of course, the issues that are going on there are issues which affect people deeply, and immigration would be a good example of that. And so there is a role, I think, for us to engage with them.
Yeah. One of the areas you've led some very valuable work on has been on going after these fixed odds betting terminals, the gambling. I mean, the churches have been speaking out on that. I can remember back to the days when Gordon Brown was pushing for super casinos, and the Archbishop of Canterbury led the rebellion on that. I mean, that's an issue you're concerned about, isn't it? The problem gambling.
Well, certainly, I think what happened with the deregulation of gambling in 2005, before we had anything online, we didn't realise within a few years people would be carrying what is effectively a casino round in their pocket on their mobile phone, with more than 400 people taking their lives a year with gambling-related problems. 62,000 teenagers now in our country diagnosed with some sort of gambling addiction, over a third of a million adults. Deeply affecting people. So our concern in campaigning on this issue is to try and get proper regulation. So we're not trying to stop people gambling, but we certainly want to make sure there are proper safeguards, especially for those who struggle with this. And it can be deeply destructive and is a huge problem for a significant minority of people.
Do you worry that Christians are marginalised in life, that people are afraid they can't proclaim their faith wherever they work because they may be suspended? I mean, they may be moved out of that workplace. Do you think that society is unfairly down on Christians?
Well, I think, of course, people, what they're familiar with, they take for granted. I have to say, I haven't got a lot of time for people worrying about it. I think there's been a few high-profile cases. I have to say my experience of going around all sorts of places of work and schools and universities, and indeed in the House of Lords, that if you engage with people, people are not only open but grateful for what Christians are doing. And of course, we stand or fall on the service we're giving in our local communities, and certainly here in Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, it's very often groups of Christians who are right at the forefront of running food banks, credit unions, all sorts of support groups and counselling groups. So I don't think we have to worry too much about that. I think we've simply got to get on with the job of living out the faith day by day.
Well, Bishop Alan Smith, from a very busy morning at St Albans Abbey, thank you for joining us this week on Camilla Tominey's show. And thank you for joining me. I've enjoyed doing it. Camilla is back next week at 9:30 a.m. And up next, it's Olivia Utley, who's sitting in for Michael Portillo. Thank you for joining us and have a great Easter. And don't eat too many eggs, honestly.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give